هلا السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام. اهلا دكتور منير، ازاي صحتك؟ How are you؟
ازاي كله تمام؟
الحمد لله. Happy Eid everyone.
اهلا دكتور هلا.
Thank you.
اهلا دكتور محمود، دكتور مقدسي، دكتور الشريف.
اهلا فيكي.
دكتور ابراهيم.
مساء الخير دكتوره.
اهلا وسهلا كل سنه وانتم طيبين.
Thank you so much.
طيبة. I think that we perhaps, especially Dr. Saeed will have at around 5 o'clock. I think we must well start now, and I would like to extend my greetings to all participants in this session. But let me permit you to ask that we observe a moment's silence in memory of the late Makdisi, who passed away a few months ago. Mahmoud was voted Director of Administration and Finance at ERF, and we really missed him. Thank you. On behalf of the Economic Research Forum, I would like to warmly welcome all participants in this panel session of the ERF 27th Annual Conference on SDGs and external shocks in the MENA region, from resilience to change in the wake of COVID-19. In particular, I wish to extend special thanks to our distinguished keynote speaker and will illuminate the various dimensions of external economic shocks of the pandemic on the MENA economies. But before I give the floor to our keynote speaker, I call upon Dr. Ibrahim AlBadawi in his capacity as the ERF Managing Director to share with you a review of our major accomplishments in 2020. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Professor Samir. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would also like to welcome you all to the 27th Annual Conference of the Economic Research Forum. Let me start by saying that 2020 has presented a unique challenge and opportunity for individuals, institutions, and policymakers in the wider field of research and evidence-based policy discussions. At a larger scale, and for the ERF in particular, more specifically, it allows us the opportunity to reflect upon our mission, on the role we play, and the way we had to respond in record time to unprecedented need and demand for research and policy advice. We are pleased to say that ERF, as a leading economic research network in the region, has responded in time and appropriately. ERF expanded its portfolio across its core activities in terms of research, data, communications, and policy outreach. Funders availed relevant funding in key areas of need across different thematic areas. Affiliates focused their research and expertise to provide timely evidence-based policy insight across various fields and worked closely with ERF management to articulate the agenda for future research work and outreach to maximize impact. Management created new virtual platforms and spaces to connect the ERF constituency and continue to share knowledge. We launched 8 new strategic partnerships at the beginning of 2020, which entailed the initiation of 55 new projects under different themes, bringing the total number of projects to 84, engaging 154 researchers. The ERF 26th Annual Conference, which was held last year virtually, hosted more than 30 online sessions, featuring more than 70 papers, gathering more than 1,300 participants, in addition to some 10 events, convening more than 550 participants towards knowledge sharing to stimulate discussions and inspire much needed policy insight. To further maximize impact of our research, ERF communication portfolio published more than 160 publications, sent out to our newsletter list of about 7,000 subscribers. 2020 has provided ample evidence of the value of true collaboration between the board, the ERF board, and management to best position ERF as the leading research network in the region. I am particularly thankful to the Board of Trustees for the opportunity to take on the ministerial position as of September 12, 2019, to assist with my country's transition during critical time. I want to particularly acknowledge the long-standing leadership of the ERF chairman, Mr. Abdul Latif Al-Hamad, who chaired the ERF Board of Trustees since 2004, for his diligent, unwavering guidance and support throughout the years of his chairmanship. Recently, Mr. Al-Hamad left the chairmanship and was succeeded by Professor Samir Makdisi, whom I would like to extend our thanks and appreciation for his responsiveness and guidance through this challenging time of change. I would also like to particularly thank and acknowledge the role and leadership of Dr. Shireen Ghunaim, who acted as Managing Director during my tenure as Minister of Finance and Economic Planning in Sudan from September 2019 to July 2020. Her leadership and commitment to ERF vision and mission has been instrumental and are most commendable. Indeed, the commitment of the ERF management team has been exemplary in sustaining the momentum and growing the ERF portfolio of activities, nurturing new partnership, and encouraging continuous participation of ERF network and affiliates. Our success is largely due to dedicated commitment of our esteemed partners who enabled us to turn our vision into reality. Our gratitude goes out to our long-standing partners, the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development, the International Development Research Center, Ford Foundation, and the World Bank for their continuous institutional partnership and support, and to partners in success, promoting development across key thematic areas addressing pressing policy challenges, namely Arab Knowledge Portal, UNDP, the Development Agency of France, AFD, Carnegie Corporation, Institute of Labor Economics, ISA, International Labour Organization, ILO, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO, formerly known as DFID of the United Kingdom, and UN Women and UNDP. And we'd also like to mention our continued collaboration with ESCOA, where in 2019 we produced a joint report on inequality in the Arab world, and we continue to be engaged with them for future collaboration. I would like to extend my special appreciation and thanks to ERF affiliates, management, and staff for their commitment and determination to consistently deliver to the highest standard. I am confident that this excellent performance will carry us through 2021 to be a landmark year in the organization's history. Challenges remain in 2021, but I'm certain that ERF is well positioned to continue leading the efforts towards best promoting economic and development in the region. And I would also like to follow that the COVID-19 has hit closer to home for us due to the loss of our dear friend and colleague, Ustaz Muhammad Yusri, the Director of Admin and Finance. And that challenge has also provided us an opportunity to rethink our way of management and how we can actually further enhance the execution of the various tasks and projects that we are involved in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ERF. Compliments are really, really impressive. It's great, great work, excellent work. Now, before we turn to our panel and distinguished keynote speaker, but first, let me give the floor to Dr. Shireen Ghunaim, Director of the Communications Policy Outreach, to advise on some matters of organization. Shireen?
Well, so lovely to see you all. And I'm really pleased that today we're able to kick off the conference with such a distinguished panelist. And I'm really pleased to see a lot of ERF friends attending already with us. I just want to share with you a couple of announcements. First is that, where are we? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. That I just want to extend the invitation that the conference sessions are going to be going on almost daily. So you can pencil in 4 p.m. As the date for your time of coffee and getting and debating some of the most cutting edge thought on what's happening with ERF every day at 4 p.m. Today we have our very distinguished panelists. And next week, we'll be talking about social protection. And the following week, we're going to be talking about some of the most pressing political economy challenges. There's also a set of panels, special panels that are going to be held dealing with, the impact of COVID-19 on the MENA region, on the labor markets. And then there's going to be another one dealing with some of the excellent work that's come out of the conflict and post-conflict economic reconstruction agenda. And then the final panel is actually going to be dealing with digital transformation and a cutting edge, again, project that's in process on digital transformation. And there's going to be, apart from this, some 15 conference sessions that are going to be held dealing with different aspects ranging across education, inequality, macro, micro, you name it. So it's just an invitation for you to be joining us. I've put the link to the very rich agenda online, and you'll be getting that regularly. The couple of other announcements is we have Arabic translation available, ترجمة للعربي. There's an Arabic, there's a globe كده, there's a sign of الخريطة العالم kind of thing. Pressing on it, اللي عايز يتابع بالعربي محتاج يدوس على السبانيش. للأسف زوم مش availing كلمة عربي as an option. فعلى قناة السبانيش you'd be able to follow the Arabic translation. وعلى قناة الإنجليش you'll follow the English translation, and if it's off, you're following the live proceedings. So that's the first announcement. The second announcement is with regards to the moderation, because it's a very rich session. If you're at any point in time you'd like to put forward any question to the panelists, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom there. So the questions can then be addressed by our distinguished panelists. And towards the end of the session, after our keynote speaker is done and the intervention is provided by the different panelists, Dr. Makdisi is going to open the floor to take live questions. So if and when you feel like you'd like to have an intervention, we'll ask you to raise hand and we'll provide the floor for your intervention then. And with that, I go back to Dr. Makdisi.
Thank you very much, Shireen. Great news what you have said and about the work that was and will be coming about the PRF. This session will discuss several questions related to pandemic's unprecedented economic shocks on the world economy and the MENA region. I'd like to note three of them. First, for how long they persist, how deep an economic impact will they sustain? Secondly, what are the main challenges forward despite certainty created by these shocks? Thirdly, how the world's economy look like after the post-COVID era? What about the region? Well, to answer these questions, we are very pleased to have Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin as keynote speaker. Dr. Mohieldin, Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, and is distinguished economist with more than 30 years of experience in international finance and development. He was the United Nations Special Envoy on Finance, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. He served as the World Bank Group Senior Vice President for the 2030 Development Agenda, Nations Relations and Partnerships, and he was Egypt's Minister of Investment from 2004 to 2010. Dr. Mohieldin, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Samir Makdisi, for this very generous introduction. Many thanks to Dr. Ibrahim AlBadawi and Dr. Shireen Ghunaim for their kind invitation with this distinguished panelists, including, of course, Her Excellency Dr. Hala Said. Great to see her with us. Dr. Muhaddis, my good friend, Mr. Munir Thabit, and all of you participating in this meeting. And as shared earlier by Dr. Samir, these critical questions, I praised Dr. Ibrahim and his team for putting these timely questions on the impact of the pandemic on SDGs, the prospects of the global and regional economy. And in particular, the impact on our region is compounded because not just the pandemic, our region had the pandemics of its own, including fragility, conflict, and people suffering from oppression, including our sisters and brothers in Palestine today. And I hope that the efforts by the global community and by my home country and its leadership going to be doing what's needed to stop the bloodshed and to put the Palestinian issue on track for a resolution to keep the peace and maintain the state of Palestine. What I'd like to share with you is basically a presentation that my colleague Rami will be sharing with us. But I cannot miss the opportunity but to commend again the extensive network of scholars and academicians and international organizations that the ERF, since its inception with its founding managing director, have been having, with great impact on generations of economists. I was happy to be one of them. And I do remember the first time I met Professor Samir Makdisi back in Rabat in the early 1990s, and the kind of generous advice and mentoring he was providing to all of us then, along with many of his colleagues of his esteemed generation of exceptional scholars, policymakers, and economists. Right, so the presentation is going to be taking the dashboard of the SDGs to monitor the impact of COVID-19. Now, if we focus on the first 4 SDGs, taking first SDG number 3, health situation around the world. And when I shared the presentation earlier, a couple of days ago, the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 was 160 million. It increased by around 3 million during the last couple of days. And if you check the recent issue by The Economist of this week, they are talking about 10 million and saying it's 10 million reasons for vaccination. because they say that the official numbers of death cases because of COVID-19 of around 3.5 million may not capture the reality. And based on their model that's trying to bridge gaps of missing data, they say that the figure could be 3 times as much. So they are saying it's 10 million cases. You may need to check their methodology, but we know very well that there is missing data, and there are lots of issues on data, especially in low-income and middle-income countries. In addition to this major deterioration in health and the pressures on our health systems globally and locally, there is an unprecedented increase of the numbers of those who are suffering from acute hunger, by the number almost double to reach 265 million. Ending extreme poverty, we have been on a nice trajectory of decline of poverty, extreme poverty worldwide since 1998. This is the first time we see a reversal in this trend, and now we are back to the figures of 2015 when the SDGs were launched. As you can see, based on different scenarios from the World Bank, that the figures of the extremely poor had increased by 120 million. So we're talking now about roughly 750 million, rather than the figure that was there before COVID of around 644. There had been great deal of improvement in extreme poverty because of growth, because of good developments, government support through social protection and inclusive growth measures around the world, with one exception. That was our region, the MENA region. That was the only country, even before COVID, you cannot blame everything on COVID, that had witnessed an increase of the number of extreme poverty from 2.5% to 5% before the crisis. Even our brothers in sub-Saharan Africa were doing better in that ratio. There is another poverty, and I'm very glad that colleagues from ESQA are here, because they have been doing lots of good work on multidimensional measures of poverty and inequality. And this is one area of great concern, especially of our region, increasing education poverty. But here I'm just using the global measures. If you need to have a good tracing of what's happening, there are 2 excellent references, one by ESQA and the other one by the recent UNDP report. And there is some in-depth discussions and analyses, including the recent joint publication coordinated by my good friend Khalid Abu Ismail in the multi-dimension measures of poverty and inequality. But again, not everybody has access to online education solutions. So the number of those who are suffering from deprivation of education, let alone the quality of education, had increased around the world by 10%. Next, please. If you go from the SDGs approach to the traditional measures of economic activities, based on the figures coming from the IMF, that the world lost roughly 3.5% of the great contraction last year. It stands to recover by 6% projected growth for this year. All depends on efforts to put the pandemic under control and the continuation of the fiscal support. And then it is expected to continue in the positive trend in 2022. But there is a great deal of discrepancy, as I'll be sharing with you. The 6%, as we know, is just the average. Global trade, we lost 5% roughly last year. It was projected to even lose more than that. But the dynamics of the global value chain, lots of supplies to do with food and health supplies, managed to control the damage. But it is expected to resume the growth in trade, but less than the pre-crisis trend projection. FDI inflows, we have been really seeing a major decline of net FDI since 2015. And what we saw last year is another major decline based on the figures of the UNCTAD, and there aren't really signs of recovery of FDI. So policymakers need really to see how best they can really compete better in order to enhance the attraction of FDI. It is not like the old days when there was a benign global environment. You do a couple of reforms and then you'll see a positive response. In the labor market, based on the ILO models of estimate, the world has lost something like 250 million jobs last year. This is only on the official sector. The informal sector had seen multiples of that figure. I encourage you as well, please, if you are interested in informality at large, there is a recent piece released by the World Bank just a couple of days ago on informality that could really provide guidance on not just the informality in the labor market, but in other markets as well. Next, please. As I said, there is a great deal of discrepancy in that growth, where perhaps we are at the start of a great divergence and major polarization in the global system. That has started before COVID for political economy dynamics and the competition between China and the US. But now, because of the uneven fiscal response, those who are in the greens, the heavy greens, are the OECD countries that managed to spend more than 7.5 or a range of 7.5 to 10% of their GDP and more. If you are in the red zones, these are countries that primarily in our region that has spent less than 2.5% of GDP. And here you can really see the impact of this fiscal response, especially if that map should be read as it should with the next map, please, with the response when it comes to vaccination. And here you can see the other area of divergence and inequality between nations, because when you see now the uneven vaccination or the vaccine rolling out around the world and those who are administering the vaccine, the US is doing a good job. They hope to reach 70% by the 4th of July, in the celebration of the country's independence in the US. Some of the OECD countries, like the UK, is on the same track. Few exceptions in the Arab countries and the United Arab Emirates. The Bahrain is doing good. Morocco is not doing bad at all. We see, despite the challenges, some good effort in Lebanon on this area. And but you can really see the rest of the world is going to be suffering from lack of vaccination. Here I'm really puzzled by two things: that we lost almost 8 months when India and South Africa applied to the WTO with a proposal to put a temporary waiver on the TRIPS as far as the vaccine and essential health solutions are concerned. That application or that proposal was rejected by the former US administration. Now we have heard the news that this waiver now is being accepted, but the process at the WTO, based on a recent comment by the MD or by the DG, the Director General of WTO, could take us until December for that waiver to take place. And there are lots of preparations on the knowledge transfer agreements. That really tells me that what I projected back in November, December, that the vaccination and advanced economy is going to be almost done by December this year. Emerging markets and developing economies, some of them will not really be seeing adequate vaccination for a couple of years from now. This is really dangerous. This is dangerous for those who have been vaccinated. It's not just out of altruism that advanced economies need to act fast, even as my good friend Mark Lowcock, the former head of OCHA, would say, even if you are just motivated by your self-interest, you need to do something about that from health perspective. And the world is dependent on supplies, on inputs, on markets from developing economies and emerging markets. So that needs really to be fixed. This should be a priority for the G7 and the G20 and the leadership of the international organizations. Next, please. Meanwhile, COVAX needs really to be supported, because we know that some countries, OECD countries, had as much as 10 times what they need of reserved or booked vaccination. So some sort of distribution here is needed. With the start of the crisis, economists, I think, exhausted the alphabet of the English language or Latin by using V recovery, U recovery, L-shaped recovery. But it's more likely to see, because of what I said now, of that divergence, a K recovery. A K recovery globally by countries growing fast, as you see in that table, and countries not really growing as much as they can really do well with population growth. So the net per capita growth might be negative. But as I said, IMF is saying 6% this year. The US might be growing by more than 6%. China is growing by more than 8%. Europe between 4 and 5%. And our region here, because it's always puzzled me, that our region is not adequately defined, with the exception, of course, from the UN system, which really defines the Arab world properly. And when they define the region beyond the Arab world, they are very clear about that. But if you are at the IMF, you have something called the Middle East and Central Asia. So the figure here, we lost last year 2.9%. This is the contraction of last year. To gain this year 3.7%. If you are following the World Bank definition, we lost 5% last year, MENA region definition, and 2% positive growth. So it was worse in the two sides by the World Bank, but perhaps this is on the global economic prospects published in January by the World Bank, while the IMF figures are more updated a couple of months ago. But you can see the discrepancy between our regions. I picked Egypt, Iran, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Turkey. Some of them are on the definition of MENA region, some of them are not. But you can really see the discrepancy of what happened last year and what is expected this year. And there are missing data. I was trying to find data. The rest of the countries are there, of course. You can check that in the IMF and the World Bank databases. But some countries like Yemen, you don't find data. And there are some issues as well on the data accuracy in some countries in Libya, like Libya. But you can really see that most of the countries are on the positive track. But there are some challenges. Now, of course, you see the case of Lebanon that lost more than 30% of its GDP between last year and this year so far. But that needs another discussion, what should be done in Lebanon. Next, please, because it is beyond COVID-19. Then I get into the second question raised by Samir, by Dr. Samir Makdisi on the regional work. And I remember that work jointly done by my good friend Muhammad Al-Aryan about the definition of the region, whether it's a region or not. And then I keep comparing our region not with Europe. I like to compare it with a more recent example, the ASEAN model. And here you can really see the trade in the Arab world is almost flat, ranging between 8 and 12%. And that hasn't changed, and it's not really expected to change unless something dramatic happens in diversification of the economy and dealing with the variety of trade barriers. In the ASEAN, which is basically an outward-oriented region, they have their value-added exports to the rest of the world, but they maintained, when they declined, they maintained almost double the figure of the Arab countries. This is trade. On investment, this is basically, I'm trying to take the same measures of when you measure globalization or regionalization, you take the three channels: trade, investment, and labor movement. Next, please. So the next channel is investment. And you can see here again some stability in the ASEAN, that their intra-FDI is between 14 and 22%. The Arab region is really giving us puzzling data that it almost reached 37% of the share of FDI to total FDI in the time 2007-2010. And I know what happened then because I was in government. But the FDI of the Arabs to the Arabs were mainly focusing on extractives, financial services, and real estate. But that declined. And I don't have an updated figure. So perhaps through some joint work with the ERF, we can have some updated figures to this. I'm relying here on a reference that was using, I think, some of the reports of the Arab League on guarantees of investment, ضمانات الاستثمار. Next, please. Migration, I just got this from a recent report by the World Bank and BESA. We can see here that the share of internal migration to total migration is still maintained between 40 to 55%. This is the number of the migrants. But as we know, there is a heavy concentration in labor movement, and of course, we have great labor experts and migration experts in the ERF community. So we can rely on their analysis today, but more important here, it's basically about the projections. This could be a nice challenge to my good friends Ragi Asad and Jacqueline Wahba and others who are working in this area, and Dr. Mona Saeed and others. Next, please. Remittances, heavy reliance on the Gulf. This is the share of the different countries' remittances and the reliance on the Gulf states. From Yemen, almost 90%, to Palestine, 20%. Next, please. Remittances are doing much better than projected. It was expected to decline by 20% last year. It maintained its value and flow. So this is a figure that my good friend, the Minister of Planning, had seen many times. This is on the pyramid, that shape of the SDGs, and I'm just trying to put it in that order to see the importance of partnership framework based on governance. It has economic, social, environmental aspects, and if you do that all right, you will be reaching better performance in poverty and inequality. So let's see how that comes without really finance. Next. You can see this kind of huge increase of colorful bonds, green loans, sustainability bonds, gender bonds, SDG equity-linked bonds. So the number had been increasing from almost 30 billion to more than $150 billion, 5 times. So this tells you something about SDGs and sustainability being attractive as an asset class in the financial markets. But is that enough? No, this is not enough. This is a fraction of what's needed. And this is an additional figure that I put on the presentation shared. Next, please. The gap, as projected by the OECD, is to increase from $2.5 trillion, which basically when we started in 2015, to around 4.2 because of the decline of ODA and the support of capital flows from the OECD countries to the developing economies. But meanwhile, while there is that huge gap to achieve the SDGs worldwide, the assets under management globally are more than $110 trillion. Our region alone has $1.1 trillion. This is more than what's needed to achieve the SDGs in our regions. Where are these assets under management? They're being put in some low risk, very low return, very low yield assets around the world. That needs to be challenged. But the majority of the assets, of course, are in the States, Europe, and Asia. Africa doesn't have a share in that yet, but our region has more than $1 trillion that could be mobilized to achieve the SDGs and help people like Dr. Hala Saeed and their colleague, the Minister of Finance, bridging gaps in funding. And that needs heavy work on de-risking, because these assets are managed by portfolio managers who are already seeing the value of that low risk, low return. So how to attract them to your economy needs really more work in the information, in the pipeline of projects, on de-risking and enhancing the business environment. Next. But as I was saying earlier, this is a chart that I encourage Dr. Ibrahim perhaps to update, because this is based on the OECD database. That could be worthy of seeing the structure in each country of the ERF region. But what we see here, that since 2013, that every element, every aspect of capital flow had been in the decline, from private flows to the from OECD, FDI, ODA had been very much stable, only increased by 3% this year. But you can really see the decline in FDI. And what you see here, that chart, in that chart, the part in red is in the portfolio investment. You can see it disappearing in a few years. This means that you are exporting funding to the OECD countries. This figure doesn't capture illicit financial flows, which in the case of Africa alone, it's close to $100 billion from Africa to the rest of the world. This is more than what many African countries getting from FDI and ODA. Next, please. So what to do based on the UNDP? You need to enhance your activities. You need to accelerate. And here they are suggesting 4 methods. And I'm happy again that Dr. Hala is here, because she's working, and I saw her excellent presentation on structural reforms in Egypt that has something to do with the first on the top there, digitalization and sustainability, including at the local level and localization. More work is needed globally. I'm not talking about a specific country here. Social protection. I know that Dr. Elbadawi is fond of a variety of social protection, including the universal basic income. Our friends at ILO are more about universal social protection, but you need to have something, especially in the coming days. What we normally see after crises, and this is a big political economy question, that after crisis, more social tensions happen, more challenges to the establishment happens, more arrest happens. So you need to enhance social protection. You don't need that arrest to encourage you to have social protection, but that's basically what you have. And of course, governance and transparency is needed, and building the social contract. This is a word that had been really used and abused. Next, please. So, and if you do that right, our friends at the UNDP is telling you that your trajectory of achieving the SDGs are going to be much better, because even without COVID, the world was not really in track to end extreme poverty. Next, please. So the COVID-19 dynamics, yeah. So this is the last question posed by Dr. Samir Makdisi. So what's happening? First, there are things to avoid. We need to prevent the accumulation of debt to become a debt crisis. This is the first wave of debt accumulation by sovereigns, by corporates, and by the household sector. The previous 3 waves of debt, each one of them ended with a crisis: the Latin American crisis, the Asian crisis, and the global financial crisis. This one should be different, thanks to the title of Carmen Reinhardt and Rogov, but we're reversing it. This time should be different in preventing a crisis. Debt service suspension initiative by G20, nice, essential, but not sufficient. Debt relief is very limited. Debt restructuring is very much ad hoc. We are missing a debt architecture. We need more transparency. We need to operationalize the G20 common framework. We need to have debt resolution mechanisms in place, and we need to revise the collective action clauses. None of that is there yet. And if you are in trouble with your debts, like Argentina, like the few African countries, 3 of them now members of the common framework, they applied for debt restructuring under the common framework. We need really to see, including, I think, Chad, of course, Lebanon is a case in point here. You need really to see something beyond the ad hoc approach if we learn anything from the Argentinian example. Next, please. The second issue is that this is a big global political economy dynamics. In previous discussion with ERF and Dr. Ibrahim AlBadawi, as he's doing an excellent work with the Western Hemisphere, reaching out more to the Eastern Hemisphere is essential. This is where you are going to be getting more of your trade, more of your investments, more of knowledge transfer, more of the technology solutions, the center of global economic gravity based on that famous model by the London School of Economics professor there, and now he's the head of Lee Kuan Yew School of Government, Danny Kwa. And perhaps there is some work to invite him for a presentation. Dr. Ibrahim, you were working on that. That would be great to have him. I think it's worth it really to see the implications of this shift, especially in the political economy parts of it. This is serious. It's beyond economics. It has something to do with culture, politics, the direction of the world, where to send your children to learn foreign languages, and more than that. Next, please. The third area is digitalization. So in the middle, it's based on a previous presentation I made to the ERF, ECS, and the Faculty of Economics, the disruptions, or Murbikat, as I would say, it's the Industrial Revolution. But now it's almost everywhere. What happened during the last year is full acceleration of digitalization. So you see it now in hybrid education. You see it in telemedicine. Yesterday, I had my visit to the doctor by this, more efficient, faster, and saves time, not necessarily money, but efficient. Hybrid work, even with the opening up, many of the areas of work are not going to be the same. We have been getting these messages from our organizations and institutions. And one big thing, please have a look at it, that piece on the future of currency. I'm not talking about the cryptos and their gimmicks and games and their Ponzi tricks and the volatility. I'm talking about something more serious, which is government money, the central bank digital currency. This is going to be a game changer. The future of banking. Until very recently, I was relying on the great Professor Zaki Shafi'i documents to tell people something about money, banking, with a bit of tweaking here and there. But now this is very much different. The banking sector is going to be different. It's going to be bypassed. They need really to innovate. They need really to see their raison d'etre challenged. So they need really to innovate and to provide relevance for their existence. The whole payment system is going to be different. You get your money directly into your wallet from a central bank, bypassing the financial system intermediation. This is huge. Next. I'm almost there, Dr. Samir. And then, courtesy of Professor Hala Saeed and the policymakers on the poll, if these are basically the trends, you need really to have an immediate attention to the following, and I'm glad that in many of the Visions 2030 operational manual, there are many of the attention being given to that. Future jobs, including the changing nature of work. The gig economy and the informality is going to be more of a norm as we see it today. Hybrid models, how to deal with bottlenecks, sectoral and regional discrepancies, and how really to have your fiscal and public policy to address them. What kind of skills you need to really to enhance. Future of migration, especially with the challenges we see now in crossing the borders, and that will continue. Inflation, I encourage you to follow that continued debate between Larry Summers and Paul Krugman. One of them is saying that the stimulus package in the case of the US and perhaps in other countries is sufficient and adequate. That's Paul Krugman. Larry Summers saying that is more than what's needed, and this is going to cause overheating. There is a very big debate here in the US about whether inflation that we're started to see, including the increase of the consumer price index, latest figure to more than 4% for a first time in years, is it transitory or persistent? If it is persistent, that requires action. But more importantly than that, we learned that expectations are more significant, especially during times of uncertainty. So that already be of influence on monetary policy. What will be the impact on poverty? What will be the impact on inequality? What extent how to manage inflation better? Japan for many years tried to have some inflation, but they failed. So basically, it's basically what we learned in Economics 101 about the sand and grease effect of inflation. Central banking and monetary policy. everybody's testing the new reaction function of the Fed, because this is the central bank that dominate the current lingua franca, the dollar, the implications of interest rates and your exchange rates alignments on capital flows management, fintech. Please watch what's happening in the coming few months and try to get prepared for that. And finally, the big question is the role of the state and how the state is going to be doing its work. Important pieces of work from my friend Vitor Gasper at the IMF on public investment and its impact and the multiplier effect on public investment. But there is, not every public investment will have a multiplier effect. If you are crowding out the private sector, if you are complicating the market dynamics, if you are distorting economic activities, you will be losing twice. You'll be losing public investment and you'll be losing private investment, domestic and foreign. It's basically that big question, how to spend the money that you have, limited as it is, how to invest it properly to enhance economic activities. There is a very big debate now on the future on domestic resource mobilization, including dealing with profit shifting. What would be the impact of the G7 proposal now on a minimum corporate tax of 21% on our economies? Next, please. This is, I think, that last slide. And this is done just yesterday, courtesy of my good friend, based on our previous discussions that we had when we met last time in the US, Dr. Ibrahim AlBadawi, in one of the American Economic Association meetings. I encourage you, please, to have a good look at this core approach on teaching economics, led by Professor Bowles and Carlin. And they made a survey on more than 9,000 students in 18 countries. And they used this chart to see that students at all levels are more concerned about inequality, sustainability, COVID-19, climate change, and environment. So it's not our old traditional focus as it used to be, when you take many of these things at basically as an afterthought. As highlighted by the two authors of this important piece of work, Rethinking Economics, and there are lots of debates now about, as economies should be building back better, economics itself needs to build its back better. And I quote from the authors that the behavioral revolution economics has taught us that people are neither omniscient nor entirely self-interested, but are moved by moral sentiments. So the very foundations of economics 101 and beyond are being challenged. People need to be more pragmatic, more humble, and less dogmatic when they are restricting themselves to defunct ideas and old ideologies. We proved through a survey that I conducted with my good colleague, Dr. Hindi, Rana Hindi, on a survey conducted on MENA economists, and that was published after a discussion in Kuwait, that we need to be more pragmatic because economists of today are telling us that they are less influenced by ideologies, but more influenced by their own bias, impact of political economy dynamics, their geographic location, and individual background. I know that Dr. Ibrahim is a fan of Danny Roderick, just published last week a piece on the same direction about that kind of pragmatism and flexibility, and basically that you need to have all tools coming from all schools in order to tailor your solution. And the right answer to any question in economics is it depends. So we need really to be evidence-based and tailor-oriented. So a proposal here to ERF colleagues with their extensive network of academicians, scholars, and universities, please invite those two professors for a presentation on their core project. Invite, please, the heads of economics departments at all universities in our region. Let's see this new revolution in the making. And I think we stand to benefit a lot. And perhaps in this new phase, we'll have better contribution to economic thinking than what we had so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Mohieldin, for these various thoughts, illuminating thoughts, provocative thoughts, and especially your last comment, to see that to go into the new economics and pragmatic economic things can move forward. I'm sure that your rating will be of great help to many of our participants here and academicians who probably will try to open the doors that you have just pointed to. Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Now, let me turn to our panelists, our distinguished panelists. We have 4 distinguished panelists who comment what you said and who will have their own thoughts on the question at hand. The first panelist is Her Excellency Dr. Hala. She's the Aegis Minister of Planning and Economic Development since November 2019, prior to which she had served as of February 2017 as Minister of Planning, Monitoring, and Administrative Reform. Dr. Elsaid, prominent Egyptian economist and academic. She has assumed a number of important positions, to name just a few: Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University, Advisor Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt and member of Egypt's Central Bank Board of Directors, Executive Director of the Egyptian Banking Institute, member of the Board of Directors of the Arab African International Bank. In November 2020, she was awarded the Best Arab Minister Award
We lost him.
Dr. Hala, you're back. حضرتك معانا.
Okay. I start ولا ايه Dr. Makdisi? I think we lost Dr. Makdisi.
كان بيعرف حضرتك.
ما كنت سامعة. I start because I have to leave in 7-8 minutes, unfortunately.
I know. The floor is yours, ya Dr.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to participate in this high-profile conference, ERF annual conference, which actually comes in the midst of unprecedented challenges, whether on the global, regional, or the national levels. And I'd like to express my appreciation to Dr. Ibrahim AlBadawi and, of course, Dr. Shireen Ghunaim for hosting this important event and for getting together notable leaders from Arab regional and international organizations. I'm very glad to see and attend the presentation of Dr. Mohieldin, a very rich and comprehensive presentation, and of course share this panel with Dr. Mohieldin. Let me start by saying first that as mentioned by Dr. Mohieldin, of course, we have seen that all the implications of this crisis, whether on the health, economic, and social implications, these all implications, negative implications on the world economy, also these implications, as has clearly been mentioned by him, will bear consequences on the attainment of the SDGs, the International Agenda of 2030 of Sustainable Development. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19, we had a decrease in our global GDP, a substantial decrease in the foreign direct investment on trade, and of course the global debt has surged to an all-time high. In addition to that, we had around 120 million people have fallen into extreme poverty. We have also about 170 million children that have been out of schools or are not actually receiving a proper education and quality education. But let me talk here in a nutshell, since I have a very limited time, unfortunately. Let me give you a brief on what is happening in Egypt. Of course, Egypt was also hard hit by the repercussions of the pandemic. However, before the outbreak of the COVID-19, Egypt had pursued many policies that had helped us mitigate the negative effects of this pandemic. These policies include, and not limited to, implementing a first phase of the economic reform program that was launched by the government in 2016. This successful implementation of the reform program has contributed to the improvement of all our economic indicators, demonstrated by a remarkable increase in our GDP growth rate. We have reached almost 5.6% growth rate in December 2019. We were on the verge of achieving 6% last year, except of course to the pandemic. We also reached 7.2% unemployment rate, coming down from 13.3% 2 years before. In addition to that, the existing of social protection programs have also helped in limiting the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable groups. You know that we've also embarked on a conditional cash transfer program, the Takaful and Karama. In addition to that, we have also started the Decent Life Initiative that is targeting increased disbursement of public investment to the underprivileged villages, improving living standards of more than 15 million population till 2019 and 2020. Now we are targeting almost the rest of all rural areas of Egypt in the next 3 years. So we're targeting almost 50 million, about 54 million citizens, almost half of the Egyptian population in the next 3 years. We are targeting to disburse an estimate of 40 billion Egyptian dollars, more than 600 billion Egyptian pounds for the next 3 years. In addition to that, since the pandemic in mid of 2020, Egypt has adopted a proactive strategy very early on, taking all the necessary measures to mitigate the negative repercussions of the pandemic on whether vulnerable segments of the population or vulnerable sectors of the population. This strategy focused on the need to maintain a balance between ensuring people's health, taking all the precautionary measures, and at the same time sustaining the economic activity. And these were actually two very challenging objectives. However, this was basically successfully implemented. The government has intensified all its effort to launch a comprehensive stimulus package, reaching almost 2% of our GDP in order to deal with the crisis. So we try to ease the burden on some of the most affected economic sectors, such as the health sector, of course, the SME sector, industry and tourism sector, through enhancing economic activities and boosting, of course, domestic demand. The other thing was targeting the most vulnerable groups, such as women, youth, and irregular workers, through launching also a series of cash transfers to support these groups. We have reached about 6 million of our irregular workers due to these through these cash transfers. The third policy was rearrangement of priorities. Rearrangement of priorities through directing more public investment to more flexible and resilient sectors, aligning with the post-pandemic. This included increasing public investment to all human capital, about a 50% increase in education sector, about 40% increase in education, about 300% increasing in digitalization, of course, in order to deal with all the services, digitalization and services that is needed post the pandemic. The other thing is localizing the SDGs through different products and different expanding into construction and industrial zones and supporting development of supply chains. The other thing is, as Dr. Mahmoud was mentioning, aligning our public investment with green economy principles. We have launched for the first time an environmental guide that was ratified by the cabinet in order to align all our public investment to reach 30% of our projects with all the environmental codes. We are working now with the private sector in order to have these environmental guides to be the main guidelines for all our projects in Egypt. We target to reach about 50% of our projects to be green projects within the next 3 years. In addition to that, in order to build on, of course, the gains that we have achieved in the first phase of reform, and in order to make sure that we have a more resilient economy, we have started on our the strategy of the second phase of the economic reform program, which is a structural reform program. We have launched this program, the overview of the program, on 27th of April 2021. This program focuses mainly on raising the productive capacity and competitiveness of our economy and aiming to achieve a balanced and sustainable inclusive growth. The program comes also in within Egypt's Vision 2030 that was revisited and being updated to ensure a better rigorous alignment with the national goals and, of course, with the Agenda 2063. In addition to that, we also aim to increase, of course, Egypt is privileged with having a diversified economy, but making it less sensitive to any external shock. We also try to have some main pillars of this national strategy, national structural reform program, basically enhancing the role of three main sectors: manufacturing, digitalization, and agriculture. In addition to that, also there is a main focus on social protection and vocational training and technical training, having a more revamping of the vocational and technical training in order to have a more efficient labor market. We still have, of course, as Dr. Samir was mentioning in the beginning, we, of course, the whole MENA countries have some challenges. Of course, still we aim to, still there is a weak healthcare system, high population density, of course, with the drop in domestic and global demand and the fluctuation of oil prices and all the disruption that is happening in global trade. Still, of course, the MENA countries and the MENA region suffers from massive debt. And with the decline and the projection of continuous decline of FDI, so there is a major need to work with the global community on having supporting the debt relief mechanisms. And of course, having, I second Dr. Mohieldin for having a debt architecture and a debt resolution mechanism, because with the strengthening and with the tightening of financial conditions, this could trigger significant capital outflows from this region, with the yields on the US government bonds that rose to highest levels since January 2020. We assume that maybe there will be continuous some measures that would affect the foreign direct investment and would affect the financial flows to these countries. Also supporting innovating financing mechanisms. We in Egypt here were one of the first countries in the region to launch green bonds. Also, the government of Egypt has established the Sovereign Fund of Egypt, to embark on more effective and value-added partnership with the private sector through co-investing with domestic and international partners in order to create more jobs opportunities for our young population, and definitely the issue of addressing inequalities in gender, health, and education to foster long-term inclusive and sustainable development is one of the most needed policies. Renewing our commitment on the global level to sustainable development goals, building back better and enhancing the whole society's resilience to future shocks requires an approach that strengthens and widens participation and inclusion, and only with a real commitment and solidarity among various stakeholders across governments, international financial institutions, business and civil society can our world come out of this pandemic stronger. I'm sorry for this rush, but I really have to go. And thank you all for hosting this event and for inviting me to share with you some of the insights on the Egyptian economy. Thank you very much.
Then permit me, Dr. Said, to thank you for participating with us and taking time from your busy schedule. We are sorry you will not be able to stay, but we understand your responsibilities and that you have to take. So many, many thanks on behalf of ERF. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Mahmoud, do you hear me? Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, do you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes. I just want you to know that I was cut off here because Idrissa went out. I have used Munir, and Yar. But apparently, I was off the air when I was talking. Just please keep in mind, let the IMF keep in mind the miserable state of affairs that this country faces. And the sooner Lebanon gets help, the better we are all better off. So I just want you to know that as actually I was cut off as I was talking. So let me go back and introduce Munir prior to Munir, let 1 second, please. Yeah, Munir, prior to taking up his position for 2018, Mr. Thabit assumed many senior UN positions. Again, to mention just a few, he was the UNDP country director for Iraq, where he oversaw the UNDP program that supported a major humanitarian operation, including the stabilization program in support of transition. From 2013 to 2016, he served as the resident coordinator of the United Nations system and resident representative of the United Nations Development in Tunisia, where he coordinated the UN system in support of Tunisian transition. I'm going to introduce the two other panelists in case electricity is cut off again. The third panelist is Dr. Kamyan Muhaddis, macroeconomist at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. His main areas of research include applied macroeconomics, global and national macroeconomic modeling, energy economics, and climate change. He is currently a consultant at the Asian Development Bank and has previously served as a departmental special advisor at the Bank of Canada, a consultant at the UN ESCWA, and a regular visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund. The fourth panelist is Dr. Elbadawi, and prior to assuming his position at the ERF, Ibrahim was Director of Economic Policy and Research at the Dubai Economic Council in 2009 to 2016. And before then, he was the lead economist at the Development Research Group of World Bank, which he joined in 1989, and Professor of Economics at the University of Jazeera in Sudan. During the December 2020, he was called upon to serve as Sudan's Minister of Finance in Economic Planning. Recently, he was appointed a member of the UN High-Level Advisory Board for Economic and Social Affairs. Dr. Munir, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Makdisi. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. It has become customary these days to make sure that everyone actually does hear the speaker.
Yes, it's perfect.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting us to this annual conference. We have mentioned in the introduction that it's being held under unprecedented circumstances It seems to me that we hear this at the beginning of every conference over the past 20, 30 years. We seem to be going from one unprecedented circumstance to the next, with a common thread is the tragedy of Palestine. So our solidarity with the people of Palestine, and hope to see this an exit out of this dark tunnel soon. So obviously it's a pleasure for us to participate in this panel. We're all searching for answers to the big question on, so what's next, where to from here? We hope to be able to contribute to this answer. So I will also respond to the 3 questions that were asked to the panelists, and let me start from the first one. The length and the depth of the impact of the shocks and how are they going to be? So it goes without saying that the extent and the length of the impact will differ from one region to another and from one country to another. In the Arab region, the degree of the impact and its duration depends on a number of factors. First, pre-existing structural deficiencies that are well known to all of us and that were spotlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The rentier nature of most Arab economies resulted in a sense of greater vulnerability due to unpredictability of oil prices, workers' remittances, and tourism revenues, the 3 main sources of revenues for the region. In the first place, the region had not yet fully recovered from the 2008 global financial crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis caused about 3% contraction on average, and of course, as high as 20% for countries like Lebanon, with exports declining by at least 50%, while debt has grown significantly to a little more than 48% from GDP. The second factor is the Arab region remains poorly integrated into the global economy. So even as the global economy begins to recover, this might not immediately impact the region. The share of interregional trade in goods is about 15% in contrast to the EU of 64%. The region's exports represent 5.3% of the world's exports, and our imports are about 4.3% of the world's imports, far below our potential. Third, the markedly inadequate social protection systems and woefully unprepared state institutions meant that people who suffered the consequences of work stoppages and economic slowdowns were not compensated or shored up by the existing social protection system, which are limited in scope and insufficiently inclusive. Add to this a large refugee and humanitarian burden where more than 55 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and I mean 55 million people in our region. 2 other features of the socioeconomic nature of the challenge are poverty and inequality. We at ESCO estimate that COVID-19 added about 14.3 million additional people to the pool of the poor. That's based on the national poverty lines, making the total estimate exceed about 115 million people. That's almost 1/4 of the region's population below the national poverty line of each country, obviously. And on equality, it continues to grow in the region. The Arab region has registered some of the highest levels of income inequality in the world, where in some countries, the top 10% of earners account for more than 60% of national income. There's also a growing inequality according to age, gender, as women and youth continue to suffer higher unemployment, lower education, and less political participation. The middle class, which merits a full conversation as a base for stability, is eroding at an alarming pace. 4th reason is the conflict and instability. This meant that almost half of the population of the region, these are serious numbers, half the population of the region are impacted directly or indirectly from ongoing conflicts or crippling political instability. This, of course, means that the impact in these countries is deeper and recovery is going to be slower, particularly since conflicts have rolled back human development gains, including on the SDGs, by at least 1, if not more than 1 decade. And this impacts not only countries that are immediately impacted by conflict, but also neighboring countries due to spillover effects. Let me move on to the second question, the main challenges faced by MENA region to move forward despite this uncertainty. So obviously there are several socioeconomic, environmental, political challenges that will impede recovery, and I'll only mention a few. Fiscal space. Most countries in the region have a very tight fiscal space with limited resources to invest in the recovery and ensuring up social burden while waiting for the economic cycle to start operating properly again. The average tax to GDP in the middle income countries who rely more on tax revenues for financing expenditure hovers around only 15%. Income tax out of the total tax revenue remains low, while wealth tax is almost negligible. Improving tax revenues remains a challenge for most countries in the region, and they range from a low 1% of GDP in one oil-rich country to about 27% of GDP in a middle-income country. With an already high debt and debt service burden, and with an unpredictable revenue streams for most countries, financing the recovery is going to be uncertain. It should not be done through additional unsustainable debt. We have been working closely with the UN system on debt issues and joined Dr. Mohieldin's calls to support the Secretary General's position in that regard. The second is youth unemployment and generational challenge. The transition from school to work continues to be extended, not only due to COVID-19 pandemic and economic slowdown, but perhaps more importantly, due to the structural weaknesses of Arab economies that are unable to create enough decent and value-adding jobs to absorb new entrants into the job market, never mind reducing the stock of the unemployed. This adds to frustration, political instability, and could potentially feed extremist thinking and behavior. Investments in the region continue to be directed towards the oil and gas sector, construction, and real estate sectors. A good deal of it is speculative, and some investments in low value added services. However, investments in high value added industry, agriculture, or service continues to be insufficient to allow the region to benefit from the fourth industrial revolution or to effectively integrate in reliable, sustainable, and future-oriented global value chains. Without such investments, the millions of the unemployed will continue to be a burden on society, a lost generation, a lost opportunity, and a threat to political and social stability. Youth unemployment in the Arab region hovers about 30%. That's 3 to 4 times higher than total unemployment, and it's the highest youth unemployment rate in the world. Relatedly, and perhaps causally, the content that education systems deliver remains far from being transformative. Curricula are limited, rarely innovative, the teaching profession is undervalued, underpaid, the humanities and social sciences as well as sciences are not prioritized, and learning continues to be mostly rote, at least in public schools. Integration of innovation and technology both at the school level and in the rest of the economy continues to be low and insufficient to allow better benefits from cutting-edge technologies. Progress in digital development strategies continues to be relatively slow. Let me conclude by trying to respond to the third question is, how will the world look in the post-COVID-19 era, and what will be the role of our region? Clearly, as Dr. Mohieldin mentioned, the globe is becoming increasingly digital. E-commerce, digital infrastructure, telemedicine, teleworking, teleeducation will all become central to progress. The transport revolution, including drone delivery of goods and services, dictates totally new thinking in transport and other infrastructure. The Arab region is not prepared for the coming digital era and must increase investment in communications infrastructure, digital literacy, e-services, including e-commerce, electronic banking, fintech solutions, and cultural e-products like online museums. Countries in the region will benefit from strengthening their capacity to adopt, absorb, and adapt new technologies, particularly in small, medium enterprises, and supporting the integration of these SMEs in global value chains and with multinationals to facilitate technology transfer and adapt it to the region's needs. The additional sources of income such as remittances and tourism, are unlikely to recover quickly. Although I heard Dr. Mohieldin speak rather more positively on remittances. The region, nevertheless, will need to innovate in terms of investments and will need to focus on diversifying its revenue streams. The unpredictability of oil prices drives home the imperative of diversifying Arab economies away from dependability on hydrocarbons. Growth should optimize advantages from the green, digital, circular economy, while also optimizing traditional sectors of agriculture, industry, tourism, services, with a high degree of mutually beneficial integration and an advantageous integration in the general, in the global value chain. Goes without saying also on the fiscal space, as well as on trade integration, these are two areas that need additional attention. I will stop here and be happy to entertain questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Munir. Thank you very much for your presentation. Kamyar, are you with me? Kamyar?
Brilliant. I'm just going to share a few slides. I'm going to go very. I hope I won't spend more than 5 minutes. So please interrupt me if I do. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It really is trying to tackle 3 very important questions, and I might take them a bit more from a global view, if I may, because we've heard a lot about the region. We started out going in, and I'm going to go out, zoom out a little bit. In the beginning of the sort of mid-April, we did an exercise where we actually looked at the impact of the pandemic on economic activity across the world, including some of the countries in the MENA. And what we noticed was that actually the speed of recovery was going to be much slower than people had anticipated. And one of the reasons for that was that, except for China, which emerged much faster because of the manufacturing nature of the country, the fact that it tackled the pandemic in a much more effective way than other countries did. But most economies, including Sweden, which started off being quite lenient in terms of restrictions and still quite is, will be hit negatively. And one of our findings was, and I think it still is, obviously we underestimated the impact, and we obviously didn't know about the massive vaccine rollout in the US, which has been extremely effective, but much slower in the Eurozone. So I think one of the important things about these findings is that we really need a global and coordinated response to the pandemic. This is not just about a fast vaccine rollout in the US, a fast vaccine rollout in the UK. We really need it everywhere. In other words, the problem is everywhere. Unless we tackle it everywhere, it's going to still remain everywhere. And this is what we are also seeing with the Indian variant at the moment in the UK. So and the other thing I think is important from our results from this paper is that actually, so in addition to the swift deployment of medical resources, including the vaccine, we also need to have policy interventions to calm markets, which have been quite effective. So let me share with you what we did. I don't know whether you can see, I'm scrolling past. There was another exercise we did, which we showed that essentially what you observed was that the fiscal space wasn't really there in emerging and developing countries, but the massive boost from advanced economies actually played a key role, not just in advanced economies, but also led to significant spillover effects to emerging and developing countries. And so they really benefited from this synchronized fiscal action. And one of the worrying thing is if fiscal, and when we talked about debt to GDP ratios, even in advanced economies, if we have a quick a rollback of these measures, it could have a significant implications for our region and for the rest of the global economy. So I'm quite worried about that. I want to also talk briefly about some of the work that we actually did and which actually becomes current now. In this volume with 12 other colleagues from ERF, we discussed the main features of macroeconomic institutions and policies and fiscal policies, and we talked about the shortcomings in policies, and I think the pandemic has shown that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of institutional response to not just the pandemic but also to a post pandemic world. So let me give you an example. And Dr. Munir mentioned this, we always have a crisis in the region. The volatility is extremely high in the region, whether it's from oil price shocks, other commodity price shocks, whether it's from wars, from conflicts. The volatility has been very high, and institutions, the macro institutions, have a major role to play. And so in the book, we do show that if fiscal policy, for instance, and forget about monetary policy for a second, if fiscal authorities actually use their policy to dampen the negative effects of global volatility, this would have a huge impact on the level of development and economic activity in the region. In other words, fiscal policy can actually reduce the negative effects of global volatility that we've seen, wherever they're from. Now they're based on the health crisis and dual shock, health crisis and the oil price shock and conflict in the region. So in the book, actually, we do discuss some of these issues. This was obviously before the pandemic. I also want to, we talk a little bit about the future, and I just wanted to mention briefly that, you know, in a post-COVID world, a post-COVID world is also, everybody's talking about the green recovery. Everybody's talking about building back green. People, and we talked a bit about circularity, and these are important concepts. These also imply that demand for the goods that we're selling from the region are going to be dampened substantially. We also need to start thinking about stranded assets in the region, and it has important implications for remittances, because major remittances comes from oil exporting economies to oil importing economies in the region. So, for instance, Saudi Arabia to Jordan and other economies, and this is going to have a huge implication, I think. The other issues are also related to macro policy, or obviously subsidies that we've seen and slowly are rolling back, hopefully, that really lead to bad environmental effect and crisis. And the other thing that I think we need to also start thinking about in a post-COVID world is to think about ways of incorporating environmental risks into policy making, whether it's mitigation, whether it's adaptation, and so on. So I stopped there in the interest of time, but to say that the volatility has really been a curse for a region. It was oil before, conflict, and now the health crisis. And we really need to have good responses to this. And unfortunately, we need to act very quickly. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kamyar, for your review of these issues. May I ask Ibrahim?
Thank you,
Ibrahim.
Yes. Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Okay. Let me say that actually I'm going to play upon my role as managing director in terms of thinking about all these contributions, starting from the keynote presentation by Dr. Mahmoud, which actually gave us the lay of the land in terms of where we stand and most likely where we are going, and including, I think, this interesting reference to the core project. So we will definitely take this on board, this proposal or this recommendation from Dr. Mahmoud to actually open a debate about teaching and making use of economics for policy in the context of this new core project, and making the kind of assumptions that are much more realistic about individuals maximizing behavior as not being rational or sometimes myopic and all these kind of which actually will bring us closer to other disciplines in social science, because like sociologists and especially sociologists who works on a micro entities, they tend to be much more flexible in terms of their models. So I think this is definitely very important aspects that we will take away, that we'll take from Dr. Mahmoud's presentation. I think also the paper that Dr. Mahmoud and Rana Hindi did on the the ideas and economic policy in the context of the survey of MENA economists, and the fact that ideology and perceptions seems to be much more important in kind of promoting the kind of research, and that I think we need to think more about ideas rather than ideologies. I think this would link quite nicely with this new orientation in teaching economics. Of course, Dr. Munir provided another important points so that to take into account in our endeavor to fashion the new direction of ERF research that's more responsive to the policy concerns in the MENA region. Dr. Hala Saeed, of course, provided us with the Egypt-specific issues and concerns, as well as achievements, which, of course, especially the issue of digitalization and the progress that Egypt has had made in terms of cash transfers and social solidarity. I think these are issues which, but then, of course, there are other bigger issues related to labor market and the future of work that is bound to affect everybody. Kamyar, I think we will count on you and your colleagues to give us some sort of insight about the future of macroeconomics. I think with digitalization and the new industrial revolution, and perhaps central banks moving into virtual currencies, and the role of inflation in the advanced and developing countries. Especially, I think a very important issue that I would like to highlight here is the role of the state from the perspective of the role of the state as a development leader. I think particularly the research that Danny Roderick did on the the shrinking space for the state in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America to replicate the traditional Asian style manufacturing drive, because according to his research that so far manufacturing has exhibited a sort of unconditional convergence. If you build a factory in anywhere, you expect that the production function will be fairly set, like almost like a Leontief kind of production function. That's why manufacturing has exhibited this unconditional convergence and facilitated the transfer of surplus labor from the rural community to the assembly line in cities in Eastern China and now Vietnam and Malaysia and so on. And now with the changing technology and the artificial intelligence and automation and so on, I think it would be interesting to explore the role of the state as a development leader in this context, and also perhaps maybe an increasing role of the state as a regulator, to provide opportunities for the private sector to get involved in investment sectors, investment activities that used to be held by the state. And then also, as Dr. Mahmoud mentioned in several occasions, perhaps maybe from the perspective of SDGs, the states need to consider universal social protection in terms of services, in terms of protection, including universal basic income, universal health care. So the states might have a tripartite kind of role in terms of as a development leader, including in this case broad macro develop planning policies, and as a regulator and as a provider of social universal social protection. We plan actually to organize a discussion with our community on June 7 about the future direction of ERF research. And I would like to call upon all of you. We have already sent a message to all our affiliates to send us suggestions about the kind of research that they think should be prioritized by the network. And we will collate all of these contributions and open a discussion on June 7 so that we can actually come up with some sort of a participatory way of thinking about the future direction of research. But in anticipation of some of these issues that will likely be very prominent in the near future, and with regard to the strategies of our network in terms of research and policy outreach, we have already started actually responding with an ensemble of research issues. For example, the ERF has developed a COVID-19 MENA monitor through telephone interviews, and we created a panel data set. And this panel data set covers 5 countries: Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco, and Jordan, supported by some of our new funders, like the British FCDO and also the ILO. And basically, the COVID-19 MENA monitor will provide an opportunity for us to actually conduct research looking at the impact of COVID-19 on livelihood and households. We have already had a call on this regard. The call is aimed at studying the impact of COVID-19 on household and firms in the MENA region. We also looked at the macro. We have 2 calls on the macro. One, looking at the fiscal sustainability in the MENA region in the light of COVID-19 crisis, which of course is relevant to what Dr. Mahmoud has said about the emerging fiscal crisis and also debt crisis. And so this project will hopefully shed more light, and we received about 17 proposals. 6 of them are selected for funding. We also have a more broader project, broader project, looking not only at just the fiscal but looking at growth, looking at other macro issues related to COVID-19, and addressing various questions. And we have received 27 proposals, covering these areas, and we will be funding 8, the 8 best proposals on this. So, in addition, last and not least, we have actually 2 more projects. One on the political economy of digitalization, which is not necessarily directly related to COVID-19, but in anticipation of the increasing importance of digitalization, we have such a project, and this project is actually done in collaboration with our sister network in Sub-Saharan Africa, the African Economic Research Consortium, which is a new kind of collaboration that we are increasingly emphasizing. I should also mention that the role of automation and the future of work is a subject of research in a context of a project led by an institution in Buenos Aires for the Global South. So that's another dimension. So hopefully, as Dr. Mahmoud recommends, we will be moving towards building broader partnership also with institutions, in the global South, as not necessarily directly moving towards the East, but at least, covering taking a perspective of the global south. There is a big project on gross employment, poverty, inequality, and digital transformation in the Arab region. And this one, covers a wide range of issues, thematic issues: globalization and digitalization, inequality and digitalization, digitalization and e-commerce, financial globalization and fintech, and several case studies from Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia, and the Sultanate of Oman, as well as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So this is a big project, and this project hopefully also will generate some, useful insight that can actually be an input, used as an input for future, orientation of our economic research. I think finally, let me just say that a very important, I think, area of research is about productivity. And Professor Paul Collier actually contributed a paper to ERF on productivity, and he identified 5 levels of productivity that goes beyond. First of all, it starts with the deficiency in the MENA region, which is that there are few organized firms that bring workers together so as to enhance specialization, so which directly means the prominence of informality and micro firms. An upper level of that would be, okay, so let me just stop there, because I think this is an area that will be further discussed, but I just wanted to close with that. Thank you.
Dr. Samir, you're on mute.
Okay. Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you very much. We are really running short on time because of this fantastic presentation that we have heard. That I understand from Shireen that we have few questions. 2 are being addressed to Mahmoud and 1 to Kamyar. So in the short period of time that we have, Shireen, kindly please present the questions to the 2 speakers.
Okay. Well, first, thank you all. And I think Kamyar has been responding to the questions in the chat. There are a couple of questions to address to Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin. One is from Dr. Nader Qabbani. He's saying, many thanks to Dr. Mohieldin for his insightful presentation in terms of governance. What are some of the lessons learned from the pandemic? Will states play an even greater role in the future? Will the role of the state institutions evolve? How about the private sector, international organizations, and the third sector institutions? And then there's another question from Saida Abdullah. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. أعتقد أن COVID-19 أظهرت سلبيات التقسيمات التي وقع بها الوطن العربي حيث وهبه الله بثروات متنوعة ولكنها موزعة في أرجاء الوطن العربي حتى يحتاج بعضه البعض. هل ترون أن الوقت الآن يحتاج دول الوطن العربي لتحقيق تكامل اقتصادي أكثر من أي وقت آخر؟ I think these were the 2 questions in the Q&A section. If you'd like to give the floor to Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, and then we can see the questions addressed to Kamyar and how he's responded to them.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Shireen. Go ahead, please, Mahmoud. Please go ahead.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Makdisi. Thank you so much, Dr. Shireen, and for those who read the questions, and very good comments as well by the panel. Let me tackle first the issue of the role of the state and governments, because it came different times, including with Dr. Ibrahim AlBadawi's response. So this kind of evolving nature of the role of the state has been upon us for quite some time now, been intensified through the pandemics and the needs for recovery packages, response packages, and with the high risk and uncertainty, the state unlike the central banks during the global financial crisis, quoting Muhammad Arian's important title, "The Only Game in Town," the main game in town now is basically the treasuries with support with some monetary easing by central banks. The thing is that with these kind of available opportunities for the state to deal with gaps of funding, still with the high risks, we see more of that going forward. My concern is basically that there are fundamental roles of the state that shouldn't be compromised if the state is going to be having a more active role as an investor. So the role of the state as the standard setter, the regulator, and supervisor of economic activities, and its fundamental roles in issues related to equity and justice shouldn't really be taken over by transactions by the state, even if they are very much needed. The second is basically that these approaches need really not to go into areas where the private sector can do better job in, but through huge investments required in areas related to R&D, high value added, areas that could be with risk, huge sunk costs, and with global, with more of an impact as a public good rather than competing in transactions in markets. I think there are some good reference in that by the recent work by Mariana Mazzucato and others on mission economy and how the state can really articulate its positions in these areas. One area of governance, just to finish with that part, is basically the use of digitalization, social media for monitoring, evaluation, and accountability of the role of all of the actors, including the state. That could facilitate really better governance models, but needs really some good investments in access and good response. It's not just leave it to social media and some monitoring, but that needs really to be articulated in good feedback and good augmentation of the state acts. The other thing that we have seen, some of the powers have been delegated or evolved in a way, or devolved as well to some actors, including at local community level. We have seen the rise of local authorities, local communities, especially with the lockdowns. So there are different levels then of governance that we need to think about, not just central government, but local government. And we give local government more responsibility, more authority, more funds. You need really to have better governance attached to it, and that is very much needed. Of course, that could be an area of work in different countries with federalized systems like the Emirates, or more centralized systems like Egypt, for instance, and how that could happen. And there are lots of good examples worldwide in this area. On التكامل الاقتصادي والتعاون العربي, I'll speak in Arabic given that the question was raised in Arabic. التكامل الاقتصادي, أنا أتصور إنه هناك فرص ودروس، وليس هذا بجديد. عند كل صدمة يتم النظر لموضوع قلة التكامل والتعاون الاقتصادي العربي في التجارة، في الاستثمار، في نقل المعارف، وحتى في حركة العمالة. فكرني بما ذكر الأخ منير تعبت، ما ذكرته عن الهجرة وانتقال العمالة والتحويلات العاملين بالخارج مرتبط بتوقعات العام الماضي، انها كانت متصور انها تكون اكثر سوءا مما انتهت اليه، ولذلك دعوت المتخصصين في مجالات الهجرة وسوق العمل في النظر الى مستقبل حركة وانتقال العمالة العربية او حتى في اطار المنطقة المحيطة، انه هناك ابعاد ايضا تتجاوز المنطقة العربية لابعاد الافريقية وغيرها في هذا الشأن. هناك الفرص وهناك الثوابت، كل المكونات موجودة، ولكن الاختيار العام لم يحسم بشكل عملي موضوع التعاون الاقتصادي. يحضرني في هذا باعتبار أن أنا قارنت بين المنطقة العربية والآسيان. أحد الآباء المؤسسين للآسيان عندما التقيت به في أحد الدول الأعضاء منها، فكان يقارن ما بين الأجندات الإقليمية في منطقتنا والأجندات الإقليمية في الآسيان. قد ذكرت ذلك لبعض المشاركين من قبل في هذا اللقاء، أنه كان يقول أنه عندما تكون هناك أجندة من 5 موضوعات في إقليمكم، هناك اتفاق على 4 وخلاف على 1، الناس تترك نقاط الاتفاق ال4 وتتمسك بنقطة الخلاف الواحدة فتضيع كافة البنود ال5. أما في حالة الآسيان بما وهم ملوك البراغماتية، فهم يتمسكوا بما يمكن الاتفاق عليه ثم البناء عليه. هناك بعض التجارب تحتاج إلى النظر والتطوير زي تجربة مجلس التعاون الخليجي، هناك تجارب إقليمية عربية كالاتحاد المغربي، ظروف التعاون ما بين مصر والسودان وليبيا وسوريا واليمن في أوضاع مختلفة والعراق. لكن أتصور أنه في هذا العالم الجديد أتصور الإطار يجب أن يكون أكثر عملية والاستفادة من التجارب، وأدعو كما دعوت من قبل الدكتور إبراهيم أن ننظر في البراغماتية الخاصة بالآسيان والبناء عليها. الموضوع يعني I'll go back to what Dr. Muhaddis mentioned. I like his presentation, his research a lot. Just 2 points. Great your work on resource-rich countries. I came across it. Just to note, as Munir Tabit knows, that all of the regional economic commissions and the Secretary General of the UN are taking the issues related to extractors very seriously, and there is a global event on the 25th of May, and there is excellent work by the regional economic commissions, including in ESQA, in that regard, and covers lots of issues on sustainability, governance, tax systems, illicit flows, value added, and rest. The other thing on your point, I meant to mention sustainability different times, but my focus is SDGs, not just climate. SDGs include climate as SDG 13. There is a dangerous agenda that could be suitable for OECD countries and the countries in the north. As I was joking with one good friend from Sweden, I said, well, if I'm in that neighborhood, I would really focus on climate because you have dealt actively and fairly with the rest of the SDGs. But in our part of the world, if I'm not dealing with investment in human capital, gender equality, issues related to poverty, matters related to basic infrastructure, I would lose the political argument and I would lose the whole discussion. And for that, I really propose, and this is an important area of work on Dr. Ibrahim, given your work on budgets and fiscal policies, there is a proposal to build SDG-based budgets. No country in the world so far has it. Only one attempt that I'm aware of at the national level in Spain and didn't continue, and some attempts at the local level in the states of India, but not at the central level. So that could be a good area of work. My final point is on that question about colorful bonds, including gender bonds. And yes, there is some work, including on Egypt and Morocco, led by UN Women, and they have partners from investment banks, and they are really pushing into that. So we'll be seeing more of these colorful bonds, gender, green, and the variety of that. My worry is that transactions are fine, but if you don't really have policies and institutions, they will be just scattered. So what we need really is to have that within a policy framework, to build on them. And there are lots of good work in this area, especially in the role of the financial sector in achieving sustainability and the SDGs, the good work by UNEP, UN Environment Program, during the last couple of years. So what I hope is, in addition to these transactions, I like the framework, and that will really can assure us that we have really some good targeting, not just some limited transactions. Having said that, again, thank you so much, Dr. Samir. I enjoyed the discussion. I look forward to a good follow-up, and the presentation, the new version of it is available. So Dr. Shireen and her colleagues, Dr. Ibrahim, can make the order of or instructions of sharing it. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Samir, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dean. I know there are questions that have come in from colleagues, Munji, Sam, Mahmoud. I don't know, Yar, have you been, these questions you've been receiving, is there anything you'd like to add? I'm going to be asked that the other panelists as well, whether there are any questions that you would like to address. Shireen, are there specific questions now that we need to channel to the panel?
Can I just say something? I completely agree with Dr. Mahmoud. I think that's absolutely correct for our region. It's not just about climate change in the environment, but also in what he said was also very important, because adaptation and mitigation strategies and development strategies in general are really heavily linked. So in terms of if we have better education, we have better healthcare, we have better infrastructure in our region, those will also facilitate adaptation in the region. So, but I completely agree. Priority for us, where the living standards are substantially lower than, say, in Sweden, where they can afford to just purely concentrate on the environment, is our priority is much more broad-based.
Shireen, thank you, Kamyar. Shireen, are there questions that we can still have time to answer?
In the interest of time, Kamyar has been responding to the questions in the chat, but I think in the interest of time, probably we can ask Kamyar to just give a couple of minutes on the responses he's had, and we want to give the floor to Dr. Sam Hakim because he's had his hand raised for a while. And then there would be a couple of questions from Dr. Munji and Dr. Tayyib Hafsi that we can take. So, shall we give? Shall we give the floor to Dr. Sam Hakim? I think Dr. Mahmoud Haddad might have left.
Yes,
but
yes, sure. Yes,
okay.
Sam, go ahead. Okay, does he hear us? Sam?
Yes. Dr. Sam, now you can speak, and Dr. Mahmoud Haddad is here as well, so we can get him to speak. Dr. Sam, you can speak to us now. Okay. Okay.
You can.
Yeah.
What about
Dr.
Munji?
Mahmoud?
Can you hear me?
Dr. Mahmoud,
can you hear me?
Yes, Mahmoud, yes. Yes.
It is very enlightening and it's very informational. I enjoyed it, and nice seeing you all as usual. And my question is, most of the time when we look at the Middle East and MENA countries in general, and we always talk about long-term volatility, and volatility is a key in every finance and economic conditions. I think the volatility, which is Dr. Kamyar has, I think, responded to my answer. It comes from most of the time depending on small sectors of the economies. And so the Middle East in general, we talk about this all the time, need to diversify from and the Middle East in general, not only one country. We depend only in very few sectors, and there are many important sectors that has been ignored. And I think one of the statements that has been said today, without taking a lot of time, that China were able to recover because it has some manufacturing and they were able to do that. I know in the Middle East it's hard to do that, but I think we can develop other sectors in order to mitigate and reduce volatility and keep good economic or sustainable economic conditions. Thank you very much. It was nice seeing you, everybody, and it's always, like usual, enlightening.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Shireen, other questions that we can address?
Maybe Kamyar can share with us in a couple of minutes what he's been responding to so efficiently. And I just want, before I give the floor to Kamyar, to thank Dr. Munir Sabit for sharing some very useful material online as he's been responding to some of the issues raised as well. So following Kamyar, maybe Dr. Munir would like to have the floor as well.
Okay, so I won't take much time, but there was we had a few questions in particular about how do we see the role of fiscal policy in mitigating these negative effects. And one of the key things we just heard was diversification. And I remember in 2012, we had an ERF conference in Kuwait where we were just talking about how to diversify the economy. So there's a lot written about this. And in our recent volume, which I linked to in the chat, we have written about fiscal reforms that are really needed. But as Monji also pointed out, it's not just the fiscal side. We need to think about also the monetary side, and we also need to think about other institutions that need to be developed in the region. So we just had this interesting chat, I think, about we need to take a much more holistic approach in the region. It's not just fiscal, in other words. So I won't take more time, and some of the links to the work that we've done, ERF working papers, I put it into the chat, and if anybody wants to talk offline, I'm more than happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamyar. I think we now have come to the end of our session, and if there are any questions, our panelists will be able to comment directly to the participants. Let me please again thank you for a tremendously rich panel, tremendously important points that need further research. Guide, they will be able to guide policy. Ultimately, our economic research should lead to better welfare for our people through policy making. So many thanks for everyone, for all the panelists, as well as all the participants who raised the questions. Many thanks, and hope to see you very soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If I may, before we go, I think I have to take this opportunity to actually call upon all the participants who, listening to this conversation, to remember that we have requested all the fellows to give us, or the affiliates, to give us their perspective on the future direction of the ERF research. And I think this would be very useful for us to collate as many contributions as possible so that we can come up with some sort of a participatory approach to thinking through where the ERF should go. And my final substantive comment really is that one area that I think would be very important to consider is the linkage between fiscal institutions and monetary policy, as Munji said, is the case of Chile. Chile is one of the early countries that adopted fiscal rules, but these fiscal rules would not have succeeded without the institution of inflation targeting and the role of the central bank. I think this is an issue that if we also get some input from the likes of Kamyar and other macroeconomists would be interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. With this happy note, I think we can call it, we can call an end to this very, very powerful and rich, illuminating panel. Thanks.
Dr. Samir, I think Munir wanted to say something.
Munir?
Just a very brief,
Go ahead.
Just a very brief comment. So I've shared a couple of links to about 13 policy briefs we did on various aspects of COVID-19, as well as on the database of all policy stimulus packages that were carried by all governments across the world. I just want to, one last point is that, at least from our perspective, we need to make sure that all our research is linked to policy making that has an impact.
Yeah.
And the black box of policy making, of the view or the vision of the leader, how does it get translated by the planning department? How does it get translated by the ministries of finance? How does it get evaluated to feed back into this loop? Is it evidence-based? Is still quite opaque for most countries. Therefore, it'll be very interesting to look at, so how can you influence public policy making in spite of the opaqueness of public policy making in the region? That's an area that has to do with with the political economy, with the institutions, but it's fundamental for if we are going to influence that, how does it actually function? And it's still not so clear, even if it's becoming a little bit clearer in some countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these comments. Any further thoughts before we close? If none, thanks again.
Just in the same spirit of Dr. Ibrahim's approach of being very pragmatic and having ERF at the heart of matters and at the heart of our future, is endorsing the request of Dr. Ibrahim for any ideas for future research, what really needs to be firmly on our ERF agenda, because that's exactly what Dr. Ibrahim is looking at very closely at the moment. So all contributions are very much appreciated. And also in the same spirit as Dr. Munir had just mentioned, it would be an invitation to the panelists to actually consider some reflections based on today's session to include in our policy portal so that we can ensure that our messages are traveling further. So just that request on a very pragmatic note, and expressing our gratitude for a very, very interesting session.
Thank you, Shireen. It seems to me that we don't want to close. Are there any further thoughts or suggestions? I'm ready to say, I mean, if I don't know about you, if not, shall we call it a day? And many thanks again. Very, very
Great seeing everybody.
Thank you all.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Shireen. Bye-bye.
Thank you.